All right. Well, welcome everybody back to our normal leadership discussions where we often hear from authors. But today we're hearing from two of the smartest political analysts and good friends of mine about apparently this is an election year. And so we're going to talk about the 2024 campaign, a bunch of topics with first Rick Klein, who is the ABC News political director, longtime journalist, and young fella who was at Princeton a couple years after the some of the greatest generations were there. And Kristen Soltis Anderson, who is a writer. She's written books, which is on my bucket list. She's a TV star. She is a brilliant pollster and partner with Patrick Ruffini, who we already had on with his book. By the way, you gave him amazing media training. He was A++ when he was on our Zoom, and that's not how he is at lunch. So clearly you trained him very well. Good job, Kristen. Don't forget to unmute yourself, Kristen. I'd say you guys stay unmuted so you don't ever make the first time Zoom mistake. I'm going to dive right in. Rick, I'm going to you first. The plan, everybody, is I'm going to ask these guys some questions. I'll open it up to DMing me questions to ask on your behalf midway through, but we're going to end at 45 minutes like we always do. So, Rick, the current polling says roughly 6 states are realistically in play. Some people would add North Carolina, New Hampshire, Minnesota, but if they're in play, it's not the race we think it is. And the two sets of states that are in play are the 3 in the Great Lakes area: Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin; 3 in the Sun Belt: Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia. And I'm interested first, you see more good data than anybody. Is that indeed the race that you see? But then second, since that kind of seems to be where everybody starts, what I'm trying to understand is, since that's ultimately all you're really focusing on if you're a campaign, are you running one race or two? Do the same messages, does the same outreach work in the Great Lakes that works in the Arizona, or do you need to really think of this as you're running 2 concurrent campaigns?
I think you're probably running. Well, I think there's. I put North Carolina on my list for whatever it's worth as competitive. So I think of it as 7 right now. Whatever it is, but I think you're running 6 or 7 different races actually, and for 2 reasons. Well, maybe more than 2 reasons, but 2 that I can think of off the bat. One is the as I think you're referencing, the types of issues, the types of voters, some combination of voter motivation, changing demographics, kind of built-in advantages or disadvantages. Pennsylvania, where Biden is from, Nevada, which has a historical Democratic lean in recent decades, versus an Arizona or a Georgia or North Carolina, which are redder states that are trending toward blue. You'd have different messaging, I think, to reflect, the kind of Rust Belt versus Sun Belt paths that I think are realistic. The other thing that I've heard from the campaigns that may make this 7 individual campaigns is that the impact of third-party candidates could be different in different states. RFK Jr. may be on the ballot in some of those states, not all of those states, and it's possible that he's drawing more toward Trump in one state and more toward Biden in another. So I think you could see efforts by both Biden and Trump to either attack or build up a third-party candidate, depending on where they think it advantages them at any given time. And obviously, campaigns are national these days, and there's so much national messaging, but the differences in how you're running a campaign on the ground, in paid media, in earned media, is significant. And there's obviously a lot of opportunities. They have to cross over these things. And if you're trying to reach, national audiences, then targeting Latino or Black voters or women voters, it works everywhere. But I think we're going to see much more targeting than that. And as we know, campaigns get run in a micro-targeted world at a very potentially local and granular level. So I think both campaigns are going to be spending a lot of money and a lot of time in all of those places that we just talked about. But the messaging, I think, is going to be significantly different.
Very smart. Interesting. I was thinking personally the messaging would have been 2 campaigns, but you're right. The operational tactics will be 7. Having been on a lot of these panels too, I always want to answer everybody else's questions. So what I'll do is, Kristen, do you have anything you want to add or compliment or disagree and get in a fight with Rick, with Klein before we jump to a next question for you?
Well, certainly nothing to get in a fight about, but I think everything he said is right. I also think of it as 7 states. But remember, there were a lot of other people on the ballot besides Donald Trump, Joe Biden, and RFK Jr. There are governor's races, Senate races, et cetera, that make things very interesting geographically in other parts of the map. And so even a state like Washington State, that's probably not on anyone's radar for the presidential, is really interesting at the gubernatorial level. So when I think about the geography of this race, think about the other things that are going on. In some of these states, you're going to have a bunch of different candidates all trying to grab some airtime and have messaging for them. A state like Arizona is not just going to be Trump versus Biden versus RFK. You're going to have Kerry Lake. The presidential election is not happening in a vacuum. And so other elections on the ballot in that state, what's the status of abortion regulation in that state? Those are the sorts of things that will make the message potentially have to vary more significantly than you might think.
That's a great point, particularly on the ballot measures. So thank you. All right, question 2. And as with always, the answer is probably yes or both. But one thing I wonder is how much is this going to be an issue race and how much is this a personality race? And I'm thinking most significantly, of course, about the presidential, where, we know it's always the economy stupid, inflation and costs are the most consistent across voters issue, across polls when they ask about issues. But at the same time, my operating theory, the winner of this race is the person about whom it's not a referendum. If you can make it about the other guy, referend him, you're going to win. But we've seen things like whether it's inflation or immigration play a big role. And I'm interested in your take, Kristen first, but Rick second. Do you think it's an election decided on issues or personalities, perceived character and competence in the personality? Is Biden too weak or too woke? Is Trump too corrupt or too chaotic? Or is this going to be more bread and butter? How do I feel about the economy?
So I'm gonna push back on the premise of your question, because I think the character and who these men are and the issues, I think, are not something that voters are thinking about as two discrete packages of things. In a focus group, you might hear someone say, I don't like Donald Trump as a person, but I thought he was good on the economy. But the reality is that the more you talk to them, then you also hear them describe Trump as strong and decisive, and maybe he's a jerk, but he's good at business. And so even though, yes, it's the issue, it's about the economy, their decision is kind of flowing from their perception of who Donald Trump is. Or for Joe Biden, maybe they say that for them, an issue like the stability of our democracy is the most important thing. And so they may say, well, it's an issue, not the people. I don't really like Joe Biden. I think he's kind of weak. I think he's old, but he's the one who is going to be a more steady hand on the tiller. And so I think in some ways, because we have this weird anomaly where we have an incumbent and a past president running for president, this is not an election where we are having somebody get defined to the American voter. I was using the other day an example of what this isn't. I was talking about the 2012 election and how, at this stage of the game, you had people, the Obama super PAC team, trying to really define Mitt Romney. Let's tell America who Mitt Romney is. He's this, vulture capitalist guy, et cetera. You can't do that here. People know who Donald Trump is. They know who Joe Biden is. They have very strong thoughts about those two things. And so their perceptions on the issues and who would perform best on those issues kind of flows from their sense of the character of these men. So I would push back on your question. I don't think voters disentangle it that much.
By the way, you need to come up with what's the Billy Joel song title that fits that, because for those who don't follow Kristen's work, she wrote a great piece about how everything you need to know about the 2024 elections can be found in Billy Joel song titles. That was brilliant and creative and clever. Rick, anything you want to add? Or it seems like we both would probably want to agree with it's not either or, it's both and.
Well, slow down. You move too fast, Bruce.
Ah, nice.
By the way, I could do Billy Joel all day, and that's one of the many reasons I love Kristen. Is I think we could have the whole conversation just making song references. But I think based on our polling and other polling, if this is about the issues, and it's about the issues that voters say they care about, Donald Trump's probably going to win. And if it's about the personalities and who you like or maybe more aptly who you dislike the least, Joe Biden's probably going to win. So I think, and it may be different to different voters in different places. I think Kristen's right. People aren't necessarily thinking it through in that way. But we've done this on issue polling, the advantages that Donald Trump has on crime, the economy, inflation, gas prices, however you want to define the economy, really, the border, they are overwhelming advantages, like foreign policy, even Israel and Ukraine. The only ones where we're seeing a Biden edge: abortion rights, healthcare. Even education seems to have flipped in the last couple of years. And so if you look at that, you say, how does Biden even keep this close? He should be getting blown out of this race. This is he has no chance. And the answer to that is, to Kristen's point, we know a lot about Donald Trump. The American people know a lot about Donald Trump, and a lot of them dislike him. And we've seen a lot of commentary so far this year about the so-called double haters, the people that have negative perceptions of both of them. Hillary Clinton lost the double hater vote in 2016. Donald Trump lost the double hater vote in 2020. There's going to be a lot more of them, by all accounts, in 2024. And Biden has been leading there. And we saw it in our poll after the convictions. About half the country thinks that the verdict was right. Well, among the double haters, that's 2/3 of the country that think that they think the verdict was right, and just about as many think he should drop out of the race entirely. That's not voting on the issues. That's personalities. If you think about that. So I think Trump at his best is going to be talking about the issues, not his own issues, not his own legal woes and grievances. And Biden at his best is going to be talking about Donald Trump. Because he doesn't have that kind of natural advantage on the issues, and I think their efforts to try to, gain confidence in the economy or make people feel good about Bidenomics have fallen flat. I don't think yesterday's executive order on the border and on migrants is going to significantly move the needle and make people feel better about his handling of it. So I think that's part of what the split screen is going to be. Is you're going to have the two campaigns pushing in different directions.
Interesting. So one will be running about issues if they're smart, and the other is running about character if they're smart.
And if he had the discipline to do it, I think he would be a more significant favorite at this moment. If Donald Trump had the discipline to just talk about the issues facing the American people, make it about inflation, make it about a world aflame and chaos, and make it about the border and crime, then I think he's probably polling better than he is right now.
And if I was a foot taller and could jump, I could dunk the basketball. So
exactly.
It's a good segue, Rick, into the obvious the biggest news of last week was the conviction in New York for President Trump on the non-disclosure of payoffs, calling them legal services when they were something else. What's your take on, and then you're next, Kristen, what's your take on how this will play presently and going forward? Because it seems to me the underlying facts weren't new. And to your point, these are really well defined in the case of Donald Trump. I'm not sure anybody was like, well, I didn't know what happened until. If you weren't paying attention before the case, you weren't paying attention to the case. But at the same time, it's just the Trump friends I have who well, they're on TV or otherwise, who say, this was good. I'm like, yeah, I can't say, let's find a way to get our candidate convicted of anything. That can't be good. What's your take on short and medium and long term of the New York conviction?
Yeah, I think an acquittal or a hung jury would have been great. I don't think a conviction is good. I think it provides kind of the sugar high of additional money, and that's important. But Trump has had a significant fundraising advantage, and I think this is going to help him close the gap. But because it motivates his base of supporters, I don't think you really expand beyond that with this as quote unquote good news. I think it is in some ways the verdict is more challenging to Biden than it is to Trump, because Trump's been saying the same stuff for years about witch hunts and about being targeted by prosecutors and Biden's weaponization, all those things, and that fits in perfectly. He can keep saying it. Biden has to find a way to make the turn. You saw a little bit of it late last week, but it's not as natural a turn for him to make it not just about Stormy Daniels, but about what it means to have a convicted felon as president, what it means to connecting that to the threats to democracy and reminding people of January 6th. That's a little harder for him to do than for Trump to keep talking about what he's talking about. But I was struck in our polling, and also just we try to kind of stay in touch with as our team as many truly undecided voters, double haters, whatever have you, as we can. And our team in the immediate aftermath reached out to 50 or so that we knew from across the country that we had come across either in polling or just in conversations and along the way. And there were a few who said this solidified. Now I'm definitely Trump because they're trying to get him. But there were a lot more anecdotally saying, a convicted felon, you can't really be a convicted felon and be president. That's a problem for me. That's a non-starter for me. Or like, I believe in the justice system. I believe in the process. And he had a jury, and he had the opportunity to make his case, and he was convicted. That seems to resonate, at least initially. That said, the news cycle moves on. We're talking about a million different things. Hunter Biden's case is now the case of the day, and the migrant crisis, and the presidents in Normandy, and there's going to be a lot of other things that happen between now and the next 5 months. So I don't think it's going to be just this thing that's remembered, but I do think this registered and can register with people. There's just something different about convicted felon than all of the other, stuff that Trump has been accused of credibly or not credibly over the years.
Kristen, what do you think?
So I will half disagree with Rick. We'll keep things interesting. I will disagree that the label convicted felon in and of itself is going to damage Donald Trump that much. In part, again, because if you thought Donald Trump was already kind of a crooked, sleazy guy, this just confirms that for you. And if you already thought that Donald Trump was a pretty great guy, then the fact that he's a convicted felon just reaffirms all your beliefs that the system is rigged against him. What I believe is going to be the potential bigger factor here is, now that he's been convicted, what does sentencing look like? And we know that sentencing is going to happen a couple of days before the RNC. Depending on which legal commentator I read, it's very different whether it is, oh, well, what he committed was basically a misdemeanor that was like elevated to a felony on a technicality, so he probably isn't going to get any jail time. He's a first-time offender. He's going to get community service, which, can you imagine the circus that Donald Trump is going to cook up if he gets to go like pick up trash on the side of a highway, to like make amends for this? It's going to be out of control. But if he does get a sentence of prison, one, I think that's the thing that gives someone who's maybe unsure the real pause. Not Donald Trump as a convicted felon, because you know who else is a convicted felon? Like Robert Downey Jr., Martha Stewart, Tim Allen. Like, you can name a whole bunch of people that convicted felon's not actually the first thing that comes to your mind. I mean, Martha Stewart's actually a really fascinating example, and I wrote a column about this recently, about the power of celebrity to kind of warp public opinion. She is also someone who has hosted The Apprentice, has run a business empire, has been in ads for Macy's, and she's beloved. I'm certain if I put Martha Stewart on my next survey, her favorables would be extremely high, right? And people are not like, wow, she committed white collar crime, she's a bad, crooked person. And so that's what, for me, and she actually did prison time. For me, it is America staring down the prospect of putting a man in the White House who is also at some point heading to jail. That's what I think will be the tougher pill for those swing voters to swallow, where the label convicted felon is simply just another label of orange man bad. And I just think that, for me, sentencing more than the verdict itself is the big deal. To add some data behind this, since I'm a pollster, and I feel like I have to have some data to back it up, we went into the field the night of the verdict. We like spun up a survey real quick, and we went into the field to talk to people who we had already surveyed at some point in the last 7 months. We cast a wide net. Our sample was those, about 7,000 or so people. And we went out to them. We got about 400 and so to come back to us. Their demographic makeup was about right. It didn't look like we were only getting Biden voters responding or what have you. And we found that the sample itself we had their past vote. They had told us in a past survey at some point in the last 6-7 months who they'd voted for. Who they had voted for in the past was 47-47 Trump Biden. Who they were voting for now was 49-47. So 2 points worth of undecideds swung to Biden. Trump didn't lose like anyone. But some of the undecideds, to Rick's point, this is why I half agree, half disagree with Rick. There are some people who were kind of on the fence, for whom this just made them go, ugh, yeah, now I remember why I didn't like that Donald Trump guy in the first place. Oh, we can't do this again. Now I remember. And so there is a chance that as you get closer and closer to November, the more and more people are reminded of Donald Trump as, and I think it's more January 6th and the documents cases, that I think the substance of those cases are way more potentially damaging than this New York case that I've always said seemed a little kind of sorted, but maybe ticky-tack. That's the bigger threat to him, is not right now. It's the sentencing, and it's the other cases that I think are the bigger deal.
I'm going to continue on unless, Rick, you feel a burning desire to no, good.
I'll take half agreement with Kristen. That's good.
Yeah, it's half more than I got on my framing of the issue versus personality question. So it's good. Kristen, I'm going to stick on polling because you're a great pollster, and as we had the great Bill McInturf on, and he's a great pollster, but polling gets beat up in the modern era. Sometimes people say because who's actually will turn out is harder to predict. Some will say, well, people don't have landlines, don't answer their phones, or maybe the proverbial shy voters. Once upon a time, people who were afraid to say they were going to vote for Trump, but they were going to vote for Trump. They just didn't want it. They thought somehow they would be criticized by a pollster for doing it. I'm interested in your take on how your industry has, during your working career, how polling has changed, your confidence in what changes you've had to make sure things are accurate, and then apply that as well, please, to in 2024, Trump has consistently been polling a little bit ahead of Biden and better in the head-to-head than he did throughout all of the pre-2020 polling and in the actual election itself. And so what stock do you put in the current polls, but start with polling and go to then your read on the current polls, please.
So I'll give my defense of my industry, and then I'll close it and hand it over to Rick with the things that terrify me and keep me up at night. So my journey, on the one hand, I'm a millennial pollster, but millennials are old now. And so I started off in the polling industry 19 years ago. So I've been doing this for quite a while. When I started answering phones, updating spreadsheets at a polling firm that was doing great work, and almost all of the surveys were random digit dial to landline telephones. That's just how we did our work. And for the first couple of years of me being at that firm, that's how I learned how polling functioned. It was toward the end of my time in that first job that the advent of online polling in the world of politics it started to become more and more something people were dabbling in. It was still considered not the gold standard. It was kind of frowned upon in some places, but I was able to use it very effectively to understand millennials who were certainly not picking up landline phones at that time. You also then began to see the rise of, you needed cell phones to be included. That got very expensive very fast for pollsters. One way to try to correct for that is you can use the voter file to do your sampling. So rather than having to randomly cook up a bunch of cell phone numbers, there's legal issues there. I won't bore you with that. But the problem is, on the one hand, technology has made it easier and easier for people to evade pollsters. At the same time, the technology has made it easier and easier for me to find you. So we are in this constant tug of war of, I, as a survey researcher, I can send you a text message. I can reach you via apps. I can reach you via the traditional old school telephone call. There are lots of ways I can contact you, and there are lots of ways you can run and hide from me and screen me out and spam block me and all of those things. So I worry a lot about what this means in 2024 for one big reason, and that's because Donald Trump is on the ballot. In some ways, the polls were actually pretty accurate in 2018, and even though people say, oh, the polls said there was going to be a red wave in 2022 and it failed to materialize, the polls didn't really say that. The polls said it was going to be close, and then everybody looked at the polls and mentally kind of gave Republicans like 2 or 3 bonus points because they said, well, they're missing those shy Trump voters. So in reality, it's probably the case that there's a big red tsunami coming that we're just missing. And then it turned out that actually was a pretty close race. So the polls have been pretty decent in years when Donald Trump is not on a ballot. Problem is, Donald Trump's on the ballot this year. And so this is the thing that keeps pollsters like me up at night, is that we have improved our methods so that we are using voter files a lot to do our survey research. We're using modeling to know what type of weights should we apply to a survey. It used to be that you would say a likely voter is someone who tells you as the pollster, I'm likely to vote. Well, it turns out there are people that say that are not going to turn out. And there are also people that say, oh, I'm not going to vote. And then they actually do turn out. So if you're going to create a good sample, you don't want the likely voter, you want the likely electorate, which includes some unlikely voters, especially in a year when Donald Trump is running. He built his coalition on unlikely voters. So that's why Donald Trump, I think, makes polling so chaotic in the years when he's on a ballot. And that likely electorate mindset is what we do at my firm to try to hedge against the risk of underestimating unlikely voters or screening them out of our polls entirely.
So Rick, how are you guys figuring out who to presume will vote and how to model this?
Yeah, I mean, first, I'm even older than Kristen, and I had a job in college that was actually doing polls for Newsweek at the time. It was one of the clients that we had, and I was doing polls on the O.J. Simpson trial, circa 1995. And
Amazing.
it taught me how cool polls are. It also taught me to really mistrust it, because that stoner guy that sat next to me that just pressed the button as many times as he could to like get through it and hit the quota was really not listening to the responses on the other side, and that's problematic. We've adjusted our methodology very significantly in the last couple of years alone. And when I first got to ABC, we were landlines. We added Spanish to that. Now, we're almost exclusively, when we do phone polling, it's almost exclusively cell phones. And we work with Ipsos and their knowledge panel for a significant amount of our polling, which means we can draw on the voter file. We know a lot about the individuals that they may not know about themselves when we're talking to them. And yeah, modeling is a big piece of it. I share Kristen's concern about whether a Trump year is just flat different. I say to poll skeptics, I wish you could find something better. It's the alternative is anecdote so far, and there's been nothing social sentiment. I don't think that was something that 10 years ago or so we thought might be the savior, but that's ridiculous now. It's so easy to game.
Yeah.
Nothing's replaced it, and what we're doing is trying to improve how we present it, how we conduct it, how we present it. I think polling literacy is a big piece of it too. I think people misread polls in part because we tell the stories poorly. But if all you're paying attention to is the horse race, you're missing a lot of the story, and probably the most important story, because no one is actually voting in June. And they're not, I don't think they're necessarily lying about their intentions, but I don't think they know their intentions or thinking through their intentions until the choice is really in front of them. ABC owns 538, which is a huge value add for our business because it gives us, rigorous data analysis and polling averages and forecasting that isn't just, is more than you and I could just do in an Excel spreadsheet. But I caution people about the way they consume polls and the way that we in the media present it. I think we've gotten better. I think consumers are probably getting a little bit better about understanding, what you do and don't learn out of a poll, what goes into it, what comes from it, what the important part of it is. We've done some polls in the last year or so where we actually didn't ask a horse race question at all, and we got accused of trying to hide something from the American public. But actually, our thinking was we're going to learn a lot more about the country if we don't do that, because we can go deeper on a bunch of other issues, and it just forces us to think a little more strongly about other things. So we're trying to get creative with it and evolve with the times. And it's not too long in the distant future where phone polling entirely will be dead, and there will not be a functional way to reach individuals, even on cell phones, because no one will answer. But we're already on to a next way of doing it through online polling. I think texting. Obviously, there's new methodologies, but I don't see polling going away, and I don't see its utility going away either.
So to stick with the polling, Kristen, turning to you, the polling this year is surprising a lot of folks, me included, by suggesting that Donald Trump is doing better with African-American voters, a lot better with Hispanic voters, particularly younger voters and young men of color. And I'm wondering a couple of things. First, it seems consistent enough that it's not one poll that was anomalous. It's consistent. But how much of that is short-term versus maybe a change? Number two, does it reflect a realignment? Patrick, your partner's book, and again, we had him on. It's a great book. But his core thesis, and we also had Rui Teixeira on, same core thesis, that the Republican Party is becoming the blue collar party, a multiracial blue party, and blue collar, and that's going to be a long-term change. I'm interested if you are seeing the same thing in the things you're looking at, and whether you think that is unique to Trump, because he's going to, professional ultimate fighting and that kind of stuff, and he's found a way to appeal to a segment that, the next Mitt Romney will not, or do you think there really is a realignment that will be durable?
So I'll split the question into two parts.
I've noticed the theme, but yes, please.
Yes. Hey, I'm the pollster. I'm the one that likes to form the questions. The reason is that I think when it comes to young voters alone, I have a lot of skepticism about the polling crosstabs we're seeing there. I just thought of a Billy Joel hook. You would think there are a lot of angry young men out there, all swinging toward Donald Trump. And I do think that it's true that he is, I think Joe Biden has given Republicans a stay of execution when it comes to young voters and the GOP, because he is also so uniquely uninspiring to younger voters. At the same time, I have seen zero evidence that on questions about issues or even really ideology, that there is substantial movement to the right on the part of young people. So Gen Z may look like they're split evenly Trump-Biden. That's not because they love Donald Trump, and it is certainly not because they are a secretly conservative generation. There's some really interesting studies about the enormous gender gap that seems to have emerged among young people, where you do have younger men in that kind of very online ecosystem, UFC, Reddit, whatever it is that Joe Rogan, all of that, that perhaps they are trending a little bit more to the right, but at the same time, you have young women who are very much have been moving to the left for the last decade or two. Issues like the overturning of Roe have only supercharged that. So look, it's possible that the exit polls will come back the morning after the election and Joe Biden has won young voters by 8 points, and people will go, oh my gosh, this is so, look, Republicans have turned the tide. But I still think that over a long enough time horizon, younger voters remain more progressive than their elders and have not, my millennial generation, we haven't shifted dramatically conservative as we've aged. We very slightly trended a little bit more toward voting Republican, but relative to where, say, Gen X was when they were at this age, it doesn't compare. The racial realignment, I think, does have more teeth to it. I think Patrick and Roy, I think the data that they're looking at is suggesting something that is a little bit more durable and real. I wonder in some senses, to what extent is it about Donald Trump versus is it about issues? And is it about what issues are front and center right now? Because issues like immigration, crime, and the economy are front and center, is that uniquely advantaging Republicans with, say, Latino voters in a way that if healthcare was the number one issue, it would not be. So I wonder, we talk about realignments, but none of this is ever static. This is always moving. Voters are always flowing from one party to the other in some way. So I think the movement of voters of color to the GOP this year is real. I'm not sure that I think among young voters, it is as real or as durable.
Interesting. Rick, anything you want to add on that one?
Yeah, someone asked in the chat about what cohort or what demographic group would be the most likely to switch, and I think younger Black men, and I don't mean young Black men necessarily, younger like as in under age 50 is one that I'm keyed into, and I think Kristen's right that we may be seeing some more kind of lasting or durable changes in racial composition of voter groups than we are anything generationally or even economically. I feel like it's kind of baked in. I don't believe though much in like impermanence at all, or even durability these days. I just feel like I remember after the 2004 elections when Karl Rove talked about the permanent Republican majority. 2 years later, the Democrats had the House, and 2 years after that, Obama's president. And I remember I have on my bookshelf somewhere James Carville's book, 40 More Years, right after Obama won in 2008, predicting 40 years of Democratic dominance based on demographic trends. And of course, Trump came in, just 6 years probably after that book was published. So you're just one election cycle, one kind of lightning in a bottle, candidate from turning your party's tides. The voting habits that you get, and Kristen would know the research on this better, but people can tend to form political opinions, earlier in life, and Republicans took advantage of a generation that came of age during Reagan. And Democrats, I think, are going to be able to take advantage of a generation that came of age, not just under Obama, but then under Trump, and sort of scarred by the Trump years. And I think the impact of the Supreme Court, which we haven't talked that much about as a voting issue, I think has flipped as a motivating issue, and is because the court is probably not going to flip in the other direction ideologically for a good long time. That's a significant change as well. And until or unless there's a liberal majority as strong as the conservative one now, it's going to be something that gets Democrats voting more than Republicans. But I really think a lot of it's tied up in the moment that we're in, and we happen to have these two extremely well known and pretty much disliked old men running, and very, very likely that in 2028 we have two candidates who are much younger. and much less known. And they're going to be fighting over different terrain, over different issues, and any of the shifts you're seeing now could easily be washed away in whatever the next cycle is. Which, by the way, will start like the day after the inauguration. Basically, you're going to have people going to Iowa already. It's immediately beyond. There's just such pent up demand for that among the people that want to run, among the journalists that want to cover a race, frankly, and among people that are just ready to move on from this Trump Biden era.
So the most uplifting thing I think that will have been said throughout the whole 45 minutes we're going to go is Rick Klein's prediction: there will not be Trump v. Biden 2028, which we appreciate. By the way,
careful what you write down, but yeah, I feel pretty good about that one.
Kristen, I tweeted yesterday when I saw the headline of a story from Fortune: millennials midlife crisis looks different from their parents. And I'm like, millennials midlife crisis? Oh my God. Rick,
are we not all buying up all the Porsches? Is that not what we're doing?
I don't know. Rick, stick with you for a second on vice president. Do vice presidents matter? I tended to think that Sarah Palin hurt John McCain's campaign. I think Dan Quayle was not helpful to Bush 41. Vice President Harris polls poorly, fair or unfairly. Is that, given the age of the president, is that a negative? And likewise, is there anybody Trump could pick that would make people reappraise Trump? And is there anybody that Trump could pick that would make Trump lovers, not Trump supporters, maybe Hillary, but anybody in the planet Earth that he might pick?
It's the latter. I mean, I think he can pick anyone he wants, and it won't change the Trump lovers. I think. Look, I think they tend not to matter. Under a best case scenario, they don't matter. The best you can do is do no harm and not hurt yourself. I think McCain probably did himself some damage with his selection. I think George W. Bush did himself some favors by choosing Cheney and kind of elder statesman answering the questions of the moment, as did Obama, and just kind of making himself seem like a mainstream guy by picking a senator that was a well-known commodity nationally and on world affairs in Joe Biden. A lot more downside than upside. And I actually think, from what I've been told around people around Trump, he doesn't much think it matters. Like, he wants someone who's going to be loyal. He'd like someone that brings some money, or maybe some some kind of splash of their own, but he doesn't want someone that necessarily is going to upstage him. And I can tend to think it's a little overrated to think if he picks Tim Scott, suddenly black voters are gonna flock to him, or Marco Rubio and Latino voters. I don't think people really vote or think that way. I think he's going to pick someone that he's kind of comfortable with, and he could go out of the box. He could go kind of wilder than he has in the past. He picked him extremely conventionally in 2016 in Mike Pence, and publicly regrets it because of how it ended. But I think Pence did him a lot of good. I think Pence, without Pence on the ticket, Access Hollywood probably lands differently, and you could argue he doesn't win the election in a different scenario if you didn't have evangelical voters, religious voters, and kind of that kind of faith that Pence put in him. So I don't know. I think he's going to be pretty conventional in his choice as far as Trump goes. I do think that because of the age of the candidates, we should be paying a lot more attention to the vice presidents. I mean, there's a not zero chance that one of them is actually going to be president, and the much better chance than that they're going to be a nominee of a major party going forward. So I think like the VP debate, assuming it happens, is going to be really interesting, and people are going to be looking at it differently. I don't think it's going to be a primary motivating issue. I mean, I think there's a lot of Trump supporters who say, it's a version of what Haley said of, if you vote for Biden, you're really getting Harris. But I don't think that's the kind of utmost piece of concern. It'd be better for Biden if he had a more popular running mate, no doubt. But I don't think he has a choice around that. But I do think it probably should be more top of mind for people. But the Veep stakes is like, I love covering it. It's fun, the intrigue around it. But ultimately, once the person's chosen, like if he chooses Doug Burgum or JD Vance, in the next month, we're not going to care much about them, like as soon as the convention happens, is my guess.
What do you think, Kristen?
So I agree that, for instance, if Donald Trump picks Tim Scott, that doesn't immediately give him some like 5% boost with black voters or what have you. If he picks Elise Stefanik, that doesn't give him a +5 boost with female voters. The question is, does Donald Trump think that? Because even if we may say in the data, no, this pick isn't going to matter, what's his mindset and where is he the most worried? I think the fact that he did that rally in in the Bronx the other day is very telling about where he thinks there are concerns. But I also think his caginess around the abortion issue, I think he understands the real potential peril this poses to Republicans. That doesn't mean he's going to be great at navigating it. When someone asks you what your policy is on contraception and you say, I'll get back to you, that's not good. Don't do that. Free advice from a Republican consultant. Don't do that. But I think I can imagine Donald Trump thinking, okay, I can't necessarily pick someone. I don't want to pick Pence 2.0. I want someone first and foremost loyal, second of all, who's going to help me with some voter group that I need to shore up. And whether or not that's actually a valid way of thinking about it, I can still see him doing so. One final note on the strangeness of individual voters. I did a focus group of women who voted for Donald Trump in 2020. I did this for the New York Times. The transcript is online. I was weirdly surprised that we had two different respondents who said they kind of preferred Kamala Harris to Joe Biden. You know, they actually had, like, I don't want to say nice things to say, but it was very bizarre because I think the conventional wisdom in this town is that, like, voters will think Kamala Harris is worse than Joe Biden, especially Trump voters, and, like, these women didn't. I thought that was fascinating. So
All right.
only two of the women in the focus group. It was not a representative sample of anything, but it just goes to show individual voters can be, the electorate is a complicated and beautiful tapestry.
Well said. So we got 5 minutes left, although I think I and probably everybody here could go for another hour with you guys, but A, Rick's got to go to a ball game, and B, I want to leave people always wanting more. I want to do one on the Senate and one on the House. You know, you guys know the drill. Republicans start with 49 senators. They're going to pick up West Virginia. I don't see Manchin's move to be back in the race. I think he's maybe going to run for governor, but that makes it 50-50. There are 4 toss-ups, according to Cook. There are 3 leans, according to Cook. They're all Dem defended. There are 2 likely defended by Republicans, Florida, Texas, and 1 Maryland likely defended by the Democrats. But that means Democrats have to run the table. And while I can totally see them winning literally any of those 8 races, they've got very strong candidates in most of them. 8 for 8 is harder to pull off, particularly when voters aren't splitting tickets. Kristen, then Rick, what do you think of the Senate, and how do you expect it's going to play out?
I think Republicans are enormously favored in the Senate, because even though we think of our country as being deeply polarized, and it is, yes, there are going to be people who vote for Donald Trump and then vote for John Tester. Yes, there are going to be people that vote for Donald Trump and then vote for Sherrod Brown. But how many of them are there? I wonder, I think the question of how big is the split ticket voter universe is a huge question for me. And can you, in a state like Maryland, I mean, Larry Hogan, even though it looks like there are going to be attempts to kind of kneecap him because of what he said after the Trump verdict, I don't know. But gosh, if Republicans want to win, you got to be putting up candidates like Larry Hogan in states like Maryland. So I think that the Senate is Republicans to lose.
Rick,
Thoughts on the Senate, and then jump right from there to the House, please.
Yeah, I'm with Kristen. I think it's very favorable. I mean, look, I don't think Texas or Florida is going to flip. So yes, they have to hold everything that they have now. Often these races tip in the same direction, so it's possible. But everything has to go right. Imagine if Maryland is the one that loses it for Democrats after everything else. If Larry Hogan somehow picks it off, which I don't think is that likely either. But everything has, Tester and Sherrod Brown. Everything has to break in the same direction, and there's no margin for error. And it's a brutal map and a brutal circumstance where it's very hard to win, especially in a presidential year in these in very red places. In the House, I wouldn't put as much money as I put on the Senate flipping, but I put a decent sum on the Democrats taking the House over. The Republicans were able to win against a lot of expectations in New York, New Jersey, California, bluer parts of those states as well in 2022, where the statewide races may have seemed settled, and it didn't seem maybe as urgent, and people were looking maybe for a little bit more balance. I think the disarray of House Republicans over the last year and a half has not done them any favors in showing about governance, the mess of ousting House speakers or not electing House speakers. I would cheat toward the Democrats taking back the House. But a lot of it's going to have to do with the top of the ticket. I mean, I think that, if Trump wins, something else happened in this country, and maybe the House sticks with him. The Senate will definitely have flipped. If Biden wins, I think he probably gets the House with him, and that's the argument where maybe there's you salvage 50-50 in the Senate. But yeah, the map is just too brutal for Democrats to overcome in the Senate.
Kristen, do you also see the potential, the things Rick's highest, albeit not high percentage of the double flip, first time ever?
I think so, and it could be because the structural factors, there are structural factors that make Republicans very favored in the Senate, the map. And then there are things that are structurally very good for Democrats in the House this time around that are also map-based, but involve the creation of new maps, the courts throwing out districts in places. I mean, those are the sorts of things that the geography of the Senate is very favorable to Republicans, but on the House side, between that and between all of the retirements that you've seen and Republicans just sort of sensing that they really don't want to be in the minority because being in the majority has been miserable. And so they're heading for the exits. That just makes it even harder.
You guys have been awesome. Very last, easiest question. For people who want to follow your work more, where should they turn? Obviously, any given Sunday morning, Kristen is on one of the shows, but where, if they want to read your stuff, your Billy Joel or others, what's the best place to follow you first, Kristen? And then Rick, obviously ABC, you are the political director, but you also have your own shows and your own publications.
Well, I am a somewhat frequent poster on X/Twitter/ whatever we're calling it, at Soltis Anderson. I mostly post pictures of my dog. But it's not a ton. It's not over the top. It's usually about one a day just to make the world a better, happier place. He's an elderly golden retriever. He will put a smile on your face. But then also I'm a contributing writer at the New York Times. And so I've got a column coming out tomorrow all about why I think sentencing more than the verdict itself will affect Trump's standing. Check it out.
Awesome. Love that. I can't wait to read that, Kristen. Yeah, at Rick Klein on X, I use it too much, a little less than I used to. I don't do as much personal content. I barely do puppies, unless it's to promote the charity that my wife and I are involved in, which is called Guiding Eyes for the Blind, where we train guide dog puppies. So that's our taste of puppies. That's about it. But yeah, I mean, ABC, our Sunday show, I get to do the maps on election nights, and for Good Morning America, and for our election night coverage, which is a blast. But it's we all are putting content in a lot of different directions and ways. That's one of the things we didn't really talk much about, the changing media landscape, but I've seen it in my life since I worked with Rafe at the Boston Globe, and you just wrote your story for that old Dead Tree edition. We're putting content out in so many different ways, whether it's podcasts or social, live streaming channel, ABC News Live, that we put all the time, and linear television, which is still around. But appreciate the conversation.
Rick, thank you for joining. Stay dry. Kristen, thank you for joining. Everybody, thanks for participating. We will post this hopefully by the end of the day, the video on Melman Consulting website under leadership discussions. Thanks for joining.